Now we take a look at the George Harrison songs, and again, I've chosen these songs because with an eye toward trying to point out things within the overall kind of arc of interpretation that I've been offering. Start with The Inner Light. This is a track that we could see as maybe the last of the George Harrison Indian music kind of tunes that he does with the Beatles, and we can follow that track, that string, all the way back to him playing sitar on the John Lennon Norwegian Wood song on Rubber Soul, and then forward to Love You Too, Within You Without You, Blue Jay Way, which we said was a very kind of Easterny kind of thing without Indian instruments, and then this one, The Inner Light, an interesting track in many ways, recorded in Bombay in January of 1968. At least the Indian musicians were recorded in Bombay as part of the Wonderwall sessions for George's solo album Wonderwall. Then they brought it back to Abbey Road in February 1968 and added the vocals, and you got some John and Paul singing along with George at the end of the track, and so it gets released as the B-side to Lady Madonna. And in many ways, stylistically, I think we would want to connect this one up with Long, 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 which I was talking about at the end of the last video, because Long, Long, Long is an awful lot like The Inner Light, except Long, Long, Long doesn't use Indian instrumentation, and is probably a better indication of where George is going with these more sort of prayerful songs than The Inner Light is. The Inner Light kind of marks the end of this sort of reveling in Indian instruments and a sort of an Indian vibe and atmosphere in the tune. What I find particularly interesting in this one is that the Inner Light, the lyrics to The Inner Light, are based on a verse from the Tao Te Ching. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Sorry for my Chinese pronunciation on that. It turns out that a scholar who had translated that, or was a scholar in Chinese studies, sent George a copy of the Tao Te Ching and said, maybe you could use some parts of this in one of your songs, knowing that George had an enthusiasm for Eastern philosophy. It turns out that if you look in verse 47 of the Standard English translation, you'll see almost, George paraphrases it, but not much. In this way, there's not much distinction between what George is doing with The Inner Light and what John did in Tomorrow Never Knows, where John took something from the back of Timothy Leary's The Psychedelic Experience, paraphrased it a bit, and turned it into lyrics. Here, George takes something from the Tao Te Ching, paraphrases it a little bit, and turns it into lyrics. So the interesting thing is not only that he does that, but that he does that in a band where there's a songwriter, John Lennon, who's been doing that a bit already. So you can see the interaction, the influence, really, of what John's been doing in George's music. And you know what? It's not the only track that we're talking about here that does that. As we turn to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, nobody thinks about that song as being particularly influenced by Eastern philosophy or Chinese philosophy, that kind of thing. It seems like a kind of a blues balladish kind of tune. And for Pete's sake, it's got Eric Clapton doing lead guitar solos, classic lead guitar solos on it. What could possibly be Tomorrow Never Knows about this tune? But as it turns out, while the lyrics to My Guitar Gently Weeps were actually inspired by the I Ching and by chants. And so as the story goes, the I Ching is a book of chants, you throwing sticks or various kinds of things to be able to figure out from that, and then consulting the book, to achieve a kind of wisdom or get some advice or things about what's going on or the future, this kind of thing. I'm doing a very terrible job of summarizing the I Ching, and I don't mean anybody to be offended by this or think that I'm sort of not taking it seriously or whatever. I'm just trying to set the story up and really mean no disrespect. But nevertheless, George, by chance, the first word he falls on in the I Ching is weeps, and then sort of reads a little bit around it, and then begins to write the song out of that experience, sort of basing it. And again, how is this so different from John Lennon seeing an ad for baby formula and writing "Cry, Baby, Cry," or an ad for a gun ad or a gun magazine and writing "Happiness is a warm gun." It's a very similar kind of procedure. The music, the lyrics themselves may be influenced by an Eastern source, but the music itself is markedly not Eastern. It's also not very psychedelic from that point of view. And again, there's a real sort of character. He shares that this music shares a character with a lot of the other White Album music, which is that there's not as much of the kind of psychedelic artifice involved. That sometimes it's a little bit more of a return to roots. Now, when we get to the next project, Get Back / Let It Be, it really dispenses with the psychedelia, and then it's just back to two guitars, guitar, drums, keyboards, kind of thing. So you can see that here. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, as I've said a couple times this week, is probably a pretty good indicator of where George's solo career is headed after the Beatles. While My Guitar Gently Weeps is pretty much of a piece with the All Things Must Pass album and the things that follow from that. Let's turn to the last song we'll talk about with regard to George Harrison from the White Album, and that's Piggies. Maybe not one that you would have thought, was so deserving of attention in certain kinds of ways, but I think the way it fits into the story is at least interesting to me, and it fits into my narrative. The lyrics reflect an anti-conformist position, and in fact, the song was written back in 1966. You think about 1966 and Revolver, think about Taxman, right? John had already written Nowhere Man, right, about anti-conformity, and Rain, a kind of anti-conformity thing. So the idea of the Piggies, obviously the song is not about barnyard pigs, literally. It's about the Piggies as sort of standing as a metaphor because the pigs are actually dirty, though they consider themselves quite refined. So you can look at George Orwell's Animal Farm or something like that as a kind of literary influence. But the idea that rich people, aristocratic people who hold themselves as being sophisticated and above others, have actually got a lot of dirty stuff going on in their lives that most people don't know about, is the kind of thing you find out about once you get fame and money and start to move in circles where people know what the stories are behind the headlines, right? There had already been a big government scandal in the 60s in the UK involving sex and spies and all kinds of crazy stuff. So that, it's a fairly easy shot to say, well, these people, they think they're so high and mighty, high and so above everybody else, but in fact, they're just as dirty. So that's who the Piggies in the story are. What's interesting to me is not only the connection to the anti-conformist stuff that we've seen, especially in the music of John Lennon and in George's song Taxman, which really kind of takes on the whole tax structure in a very kind of funny way, sort of playing with the humor. But what's interesting to me is the ironic use of classical music. Now, we talked about John with Happiness is a Warm Gun using 50s music in a kind of ironic way, that is in a distance way. I'm not saying this is 50s music. I'm playing with the idea of 50s music. I'm sort of doing it in a kind of postmodern, sort of in quotation marks kind of way, right? Well, that's what George is doing with classical music. Classical music becomes emblematic of the high society that he's making fun of. So to use the harpsichord and the strings and all that kind of thing in this, while he's talking about the basic hypocritical nature of these cultural elites, is a way of using their own music as a kind of blunt instrument with which to sort of beat them over the head. And so it's not like he's endorsing classical music. He's using it as a kind of weapon, as a kind of mode of attack. And I would ask you to contrast that with Paul McCartney's more earnest approach to the use of classical music. Paul uses classical music in Eleanor Rigby, or when Paul uses classical music in She's Leaving Home. There's nothing ironic about that. He's embracing classical music for No One, the French horn, the piccolo trumpet in Penny Lane. He's embracing classical music because it adds some classiness to his music, not because he's trying to make fun of cultural elites. He wants to be one of those cultural elites, presumably, right? George Harrison using it in a very ironic kind of way, and I think that's significant in this particular use of classical music. Again, and even on this album, compare this use of classical music on Piggies with Paul's use of classical music on something like Mother Nature's Son. and you see a real difference in approach, one that's more similar to John Lennon's use of 50s music in Happiness is a Warm Gun. Of course, there's the humor that goes with it. This is all supposed to be kind of a sarcastic send-up, a kind of a satire in a certain kind of way. And so we can see the humor coming from tunes like Taxman, and especially Savoy Truffle, right, which is another kind of humorous tune that's on this album, so it's kind of a pair with that. One last thing I'd like to say about Piggies before we move on to talking about Yellow Submarine is that Piggies is sequenced on the album between Blackbird and Rocky Raccoon. And apparently some sources say this was very conscious by Lennon and McCartney to put these three sort of animal songs together, so you get Blackbird, Piggies, and Rocky Raccoon. And you got to wonder whether this was all a big kind of gag around the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, right, which had been a very impressive album that they had competed directly with. We talked about Paul McCartney's Here, There, and Everywhere as an answer to God Only Knows, right? And so Paul, very aware of pet sounds. Of course, there are all kinds of animal sounds that are used at the end of Piggies as well. So who knows? But anyway, the connection of three animal songs in a row may be an interesting one here. Well, let's finish up this week's lectures by turning our attention to the film that is a Beatles film that the Beatles hardly had anything to do with, Yellow Submarine.